They left her to die in the snow, but the man she saved would one day burn the world to protect her. The wind howled like a living thing that night, tearing across the endless white plains of 1879 as if it meant to erase every trace of life. And in its path stumbled Eliza Hart, barely more than a shadow wrapped in torn fabric, her breath shallow, her stomach hollow, her strength nearly gone. Just hours earlier, she had been thrown out of the only place she had known as home, accused of stealing a jeweled brooch she had never even touched, her pleas drowned out by the cold laughter of the wealthy household she had served since childhood. And when they pushed her out into the storm with nothing but a thin shawl and a warning never to return, something inside her broke, but not enough to stop her from walking. She didn't know where she was going. She only knew she couldn't stay. Each step through the snow felt heavier than the last, her shoes soaked through, her fingers numb, her thoughts drifting dangerously between memory and oblivion. Her mother's voice, long gone, whispering to keep moving, keep breathing, keep fighting. But the storm didn't care about voices or memories. It swallowed everything. Hours passed, or maybe minutes. Time had lost meaning, until Eliza's legs finally buckled beneath her and she collapsed into the snow, her body too weak to rise again, her vision blurring into white emptiness as she accepted, with a strange, quiet calm, that this was how it would end. But fate, it seemed, had other plans, because just as her eyes began to close, she saw something, dark against the endless white, a shape that didn't belong. At first, she thought it was a trick of her fading mind, but then the wind shifted, revealing the outline of a fallen horse, half buried in snow. And beneath it a man. Something inside her, something stubborn and unyielding, refused to let her ignore it. With the last scraps of strength she didn't know she had left, Eliza dragged herself toward the figure, her hands trembling as she brushed snow away from the man's face. He was alive, barely. His skin was pale, his lips blue, a deep wound along his side soaked through with frozen blood. He should have been dead already. Maybe he would be, if she left him. For a long moment, Eliza just stared at him, her own body screaming for rest, for surrender, for the peace of simply letting go. She had nothing. No food, no shelter, no help. Saving him would only make her chances worse. But then, without fully understanding why, she made her choice. "You're not dying out here," she whispered, her voice cracked and barely audible over the wind, as if saying it aloud made it real. It took everything she had, every ounce of will, every flicker of life left in her. But Eliza managed to free the man from beneath the horse and drag him, inch by agonizing inch, toward a cluster of jagged rocks nearby that offered the smallest hint of shelter from the storm. Her hands bled. Her vision darkened. More than once, she nearly collapsed beside him, ready to give in. But each time, she forced herself to keep moving, because if she stopped they both would die. By the time she reached the rocks, her body was shaking uncontrollably, her breath ragged, her strength completely spent. But she wasn't finished. Not yet. Tearing strips from her already ruined dress, Eliza did what she could to clean and bind the man's wound, her fingers clumsy and numb as she worked. She had no proper training, only the fragments of knowledge she'd picked up while tending to her former mistress's endless complaints. But it was enough to try, enough to care, enough to fight for a life that wasn't her own. The storm raged on through the night, trapping them in that frozen corner of the world, and as the hours passed, Eliza did everything she could to keep him alive. She melted snow for water, pressing it carefully to his lips. She shielded him from the wind with her own body, even as the cold seeped deeper into her bones. She spoke to him, though she didn't know his name, her voice soft and steady, as if he could hear her somewhere beyond the darkness. "You're going to make it," she murmured again and again, more for herself than for him. "You have to." And slowly, impossibly, something began to change. His breathing steadied. The fever that had threatened to take him eased, just slightly. He wasn't out of danger, not even close, but he was still alive. And so was she. Dawn came like a pale promise, the storm finally beginning to loosen its grip on the land, the wind softening into a whisper. Eliza barely noticed. She had drifted in and out of consciousness through the night, her body pushed far beyond its limits, her strength hanging by a thread. She didn't know how much longer she could hold on, but she stayed. Because she had chosen this. Because leaving now would make everything she'd done meaningless. And then, just as the first weak light of morning broke across the snow, the man stirred. It was subtle at first, a shift, a breath, a flicker of movement, but it was enough. Eliza forced her eyes open, her vision swimming as she looked down at him. His lashes fluttered, his brow furrowing as if fighting his way back from somewhere far away. And then, slowly, his eyes opened. They were sharp, even in his weakened state. Dark, steady, alive. Confused, yes. Pain-filled, certainly. But alive. And the first thing he saw was her. A starving, half-frozen girl with bloodied hands and hollow eyes. Barely clinging to life herself, yet still watching over him as if nothing else in the world mattered. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The wind had quieted. The storm had passed. And in that fragile, silent space between survival and something more, a single truth settled in. Unspoken, undeniable. She had saved him, and whether she knew it or not, that choice was about to change both their lives forever. He could have left her behind the moment he regained his strength, but the man she pulled from death refused to forget the girl who chose him over herself. When Caleb Boone finally found his voice, it came rough and low, like something dragged back from the edge of the grave, his eyes never leaving the frail figure beside him, as if he couldn't quite understand how she was real, how someone so close to breaking had managed to keep him alive through a storm that should have taken them both. Eliza barely heard him at first, her body giving in now that the danger had passed, her strength unraveling piece by piece until she slumped against the cold rock, her breathing shallow, her vision dimming, but not before she felt it. His hand, weak but determined, gripping hers. "Stay," he rasped, though he was in no position to command anything, let alone life itself. And yet something in his voice, something steady, grounded, cut through the fog threatening to swallow her whole. Hours later, when the sun climbed higher and the snow began to ease its grip on the land, Caleb forced himself to move, every inch of his body screaming in protest as he pushed past the pain, driven by something far stronger than survival now. He gathered what little remained of his strength and managed to signal a passing rider, a ranch hand who nearly fell from his horse at the sight of him. And within what felt like minutes but must have been hours, Eliza found herself lifted into unfamiliar arms, her body too weak to resist, her mind drifting in and out as voices surrounded her, urgent, confused, demanding answers she couldn't give. By the time she woke again, the world had changed. Gone was the endless white and biting wind, replaced by warmth, real warmth, that wrapped around her like something she had long forgotten existed. The ceiling above her was wooden, solid, safe. The bed beneath her was soft, and for a terrifying moment, she thought she had died. But then the door opened, and he walked in. Caleb Boone, no longer just a wounded stranger buried in snow, but something else entirely, clean, composed, his presence filling the room with a quiet authority that made it clear he was no ordinary man. His wound was bandaged properly now, though the stiffness in his movements betrayed the pain he still carried. And yet none of that seemed to matter as his gaze found her, steady and searching, as if confirming she was still there. "You made it," he said simply, but there was weight behind those words, something deeper than gratitude, something that lingered in the silence that followed. Eliza tried to sit up, panic flickering through her as fragments of memory rushed back. The accusation, the cold faces, the door slamming behind her. But her body refused, and before she could push herself too far, he was there, stopping her with a firmness that left no room for argument. "You're safe here," he added, his tone quieter now, almost careful, as if he understood that safety was not a word she trusted easily. Days turned into weeks, and slowly, Eliza began to recover. She learned the rhythm of the ranch, the distant sound of cattle, the steady movement of workers, the quiet efficiency of a place built on order and power. And though she kept to herself, it didn't take long for whispers to start. No one knew exactly who she was, only that she had arrived with Caleb, half dead and dressed like a beggar, and that alone was enough to spark suspicion. Servants watched her with narrowed eyes. Ranch hands muttered under their breath. And Eliza, who had learned long ago how quickly kindness could turn into cruelty, kept her head down and her voice quiet, expecting, waiting, For the moment, it would all be taken away again. But Caleb did not send her away. If anything, he did the opposite. He made sure she was fed before anyone else noticed she was hungry. He ensured she had proper clothes, a warm place to sleep, and work that didn't push her beyond what she could handle. He never asked for repayment, never demanded answers, never treated her like anything less than someone who belonged there. And that, more than anything, unsettled her. Because men like him, powerful, respected, feared, did not go out of their way for girls like her. They did not protect them. They certainly did not look at them the way he sometimes did, as if trying to understand something he couldn't quite name. But the past has a way of catching up, no matter how far you run. It started with a single rider arriving at the ranch gates, his coat marked with the authority of the law, his expression hard and certain as he asked for Caleb Boone by name. Eliza felt it before she heard it. The shift in the air, the tension that spread through the workers, the way conversations quieted just enough to listen. And when the man spoke, her world threatened to collapse all over again. "I'm looking for a girl," he said, his voice carrying across the yard. "Name of Eliza Hart. Wanted for theft." The words hit like a blow, sharp and unforgiving, dragging her back to that night. The accusations, the betrayal, the cold certainty in their voices as they cast her out without a second thought. She froze, every instinct screaming at her to run, to disappear before it was too late. Because this was how it always ended. Safety was an illusion. Kindness was temporary. And no matter how far she went, the past would find her. But before she could move, before fear could take control, Caleb stepped forward. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The authority in his presence alone was enough to silence the murmurs, to draw every eye toward him as he faced the lawman without hesitation. "You've got proof?" he asked, calm, steady, unshaken. The man faltered, just slightly, clearly not expecting resistance. "Word from a reputable household," he replied, though there was less certainty in his tone now. Caleb's gaze didn't waver. "Word isn't proof," he said. And then, after a pause that seemed to stretch across the entire yard, he added, "And you're not taking anyone off my land without it." It was a line drawn, clear, undeniable, impossible to ignore. The lawman hesitated, caught between duty and the unspoken reality of who Caleb Boone was, and after a tense moment, he gave a stiff nod, muttering something about returning with proper documentation before turning his horse and riding away. The tension lingered long after he was gone, the weight of what had just happened settling over everything. Eliza stood where she was, her heart racing, her breath unsteady, unable to fully process what she had just witnessed. No one had ever stood up for her before. No one had ever chosen her side. And yet he had done it without hesitation, without question, as if it was the most natural thing in the world. Slowly, she lifted her gaze to him, confusion and disbelief written plainly across her face. "Why?" she managed, her voice barely above a whisper. Caleb looked at her then, not as a ranch owner, not as a man of power, but as someone who had once been on the edge of death, staring up at a girl who refused to let him fall. "Because I know what I owe you," he said at first. But then his expression shifted, something deeper surfacing beneath the surface, something that went beyond debt, beyond obligation, beyond anything either of them had expected. "And because," he added quietly, "I don't believe a word of it." In that moment, something changed. Not just in him, but in her. Because for the first time since the world had turned against her, someone saw her and chose to stay. He could have settled his debt and let her walk away. But instead, he chose her. And in doing so, he changed everything. The morning Caleb rode into town, the sky was clear but the air still carried the bite of winter, sharp enough to remind anyone how close death had come only days before. And yet his focus was not on the cold or the miles ahead, but on the truth that had been buried beneath wealth and lies. Eliza watched him leave from the edge of the ranch, her hands clenched tightly in the fabric of her dress, her heart caught between hope and fear, because no matter what he believed, the world had already judged her once, and it rarely changed its mind. But Caleb Boone was not a man who accepted things as they were, especially not when something didn't sit right with him. By the time he reached the town, word had already begun to spread of his arrival, doors opening just enough for curious eyes to peek through, whispers trailing behind him as he made his way straight to the estate of the very family that had accused Eliza. The Whitmores, a name that carried influence, money, and the kind of power that silenced questions before they could be asked. They greeted him with practiced politeness, smiles too quick, voices too smooth. But Caleb had seen enough of the world to recognize deception when it stood right in front of him. He didn't waste time with pleasantries. He asked about the brooch, about the night it supposedly went missing, about the evidence that had led them to cast out a girl in the middle of a snowstorm without so much as a second thought. At first, their answers came easily, rehearsed, confident, but the more he pressed, the more cracks began to show. Timelines didn't match. Details shifted. And then, with the careful persistence of a man who refused to be misled, Caleb uncovered what they had tried so hard to bury. The brooch had never been stolen at all. It had been misplaced, hidden away during a private gathering, forgotten in the chaos. And when it resurfaced days later, they had chosen silence over truth, too proud, too concerned with their own reputation to admit their mistake. Letting a servant take the blame had simply been convenient. But it didn't end there. Because in their effort to protect themselves, they had ensured Eliza could never return, never speak, never challenge them. And in doing so, they had nearly killed her. Caleb's anger was not loud, not explosive, but it was absolute, a quiet force that left no room for negotiation as he made it clear that this would not be buried, not this time. By the end of the day, the truth was no longer something they could hide behind closed doors. Word spread quickly, carried by townsfolk who had long suspected the cracks beneath the Whitmores' polished image, and by the time Caleb returned to the ranch, Eliza's name had already begun to change, from thief to victim. She didn't believe it at first. When he told her, standing there in the fading light with the weight of everything he had uncovered in his eyes, she simply stared at him, waiting for the part where it all fell apart again, where the truth didn't matter, where the world chose the easier story. But that moment never came. Instead, he placed the truth in her hands, clear, undeniable, and for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, the burden she had carried began to lift. She was free, truly free, and with that freedom came a choice she hadn't expected to have. Staying had never been part of her plan. The ranch had been a place to recover, nothing more, a temporary shelter before she moved on, before she found somewhere she truly belonged. But as she packed the few things she now owned, preparing to leave before she could overstay her welcome, something felt different. The silence wasn't the same. The walls didn't feel cold. And the thought of stepping back into a world that had once turned its back on her no longer felt like escape. It felt like loss. She didn't hear him approach, but she felt his presence before he spoke, steady and certain, the same way it had been the day he opened his eyes in that frozen shelter. "You're leaving," Caleb said, not as a question, but as a realization he had been expecting and dreading all at once. Eliza didn't turn around right away. "I was never meant to stay," she replied softly, though the words didn't carry the same certainty they once would have. For a moment, neither of them moved, the space between them filled with everything that had been said and everything that hadn't. Then Caleb stepped forward, closing that distance in a way that felt both simple and impossible all at once. "That's where you're wrong," he said, his voice low but unwavering. She turned then, finally meeting his gaze, and whatever she saw there made her breath catch. Not authority, not obligation, but something far more dangerous. Something real. "You chose to save me when you had nothing," he continued, each word deliberate, each one carrying more weight than the last. "You stayed when you could have walked away. And somewhere between that storm and now," he paused, as if the next words mattered more than anything he had ever said before. "You became someone I can't just let disappear." Eliza's heart pounded, her thoughts tangled in a way she couldn't untangle, because this was not something she had prepared for. Not kindness, not loyalty, and certainly not this quiet, undeniable pull that had been growing between them without either of them naming it. "I don't belong here," she said, though the words felt weaker now, uncertain. Caleb shook his head, just slightly. "You do," he replied, "if you want to." It wasn't a command. It wasn't an expectation. It was something far more rare, a choice, one that belonged entirely to her. And for the first time in her life, Eliza realized she had the power to make it. The past no longer held her. The accusations no longer defied her. The storm that had nearly taken her life had also given her something she had never known before, a place, a future, and a man who had seen her at her lowest and still chose her. Slowly, she set her bag down, the sound soft but final, and in that small, quiet moment, everything shifted. Because the starving maid who had once been cast out into the snow was gone. In her place stood a woman who had survived, who had fought, who had been seen, and who, against all odds, had found a world that chose her back.